systems go. Clear for liftoff.
Yo, what's going on, golf fans? It's your boy, GS Luke, with our Round 4 Showdown stream for the Rocket Classic. Going to get you guys ready for all of your exposure tomorrow with a look at the weather report, some strategy for Sunday, which is a little bit different with the placement points in play. We'll go through any player pool deep dives that you've got for me in the chat, some strategy towards the end, putting together a lineup or two to show you how it's done. And hopefully we can cap off this week with a little bit of a bang and get ourselves into the profit. So welcome in, everyone. Hopefully everyone's having a fantastic Saturday. Feel free to say hi in the chat, smash that like button as you guys get in here as well. And any sort of player pool deep dives that you got, go ahead and let me know because we'll touch on all those later. But it looks like Robert's ready to go early in the chat. Same thing with Steven, a few sweaty tryhards here early. And let's get after it. And like I said, only thing I need from you guys is to hit that like button for me. And without further ado, let's get this thing going. So this course today played really even between the first and second half. However, I would say that the first few hours of play were certainly easier than the rest of it because you had a -2.5 scoring average going on until about 11 or even about noon. So through the first 12 to 14 holes, those guys were killing it. However, the wind kicked up rather early, and by the end, it looked pretty flat between the morning and the afternoon. But what you have to keep in mind is that the afternoon had the players in contention, some of your better players in general that were towards the top end of the board that you would have expected to play to maybe a half a stroke better average. So though it looks like it's even on paper, there was a slight conditions advantage to those going off early. And if we take a look at some of those ceiling rounds, you'll see that reflected with Goddard, Chandler Phillips, were a few of the players that took advantage of the softer conditions. Even a Davis Thompson, who had 3 eagles on the front nine alone, showed you what soft conditions and no wind can do. But unlike today where we had that little bit of a micro edge pop up, it looks extremely flat for Sunday. So across the board, it looks pretty much like there's not going to be any wind out there. It could get slightly firmer and faster in the afternoon. Also, the greens could be a little bit less perfect, but much like today where the guys going off later are going to be your best players in the field, it is even more so the case after 54 holes now. So I would say that it's going to look pretty flat when it's all said and done. And weather, especially with the placement points in play for a round 4 slate, isn't going to be the biggest factor that we're looking at. But we always like to take a look at this forecast just in case there's any sort of big disparity in the scoring, because if so, sometimes it could incentivize us to try and take some early starters and add in a little bit more leverage than usual. But that's not really the case here. I would actually argue that with the higher temperatures, that your later starters might even play to a slightly easier scoring average. That's possible if the course remains relatively receptive throughout the day. And that's been the case for this entire week. So that's why I'm not really playing a massive lean in either direction. So for my leverage pieces, you're going to see me going to some of the mid tee time players just because they're getting the same kind of conditions and they're playing a little bit better than the guys going off first thing off tomorrow morning. So I think that anyone is in play, right? You don't have to eliminate anyone based on their tee time, but just personally, and where I went with my exposure on my Patreon page was players that were closer to 10 to maybe a 12 o'clock tee time that aren't in contention, but they also aren't playing terrible golf to this point, where they're going to be a lot lower owned. Of course, the guys teeing off later tomorrow, your players in contention are going to be the ones that are getting far more ownership in pretty much every contest on DraftKings. But if you go slightly earlier for those leverage pieces, it's not like a massive drop off in form. They're still playing solid golf. They made the cut. They're still, maybe at that T30 mark on the leaderboard. Still very valuable, in my opinion, for some DFS lineups. So just to give you an idea of some of those players, that's where Cam Young's teeing off. Kurt Kitayama's a standout player. Luke List ball striking stats really have stood out for the first 3 rounds at this point. Just can't buy a putt for his life. these kind of players are playing half decent golf through the first 54 holes and aren't getting the same kind of respect as these guys that are teeing off later. And that's always going to be the case when we have the placement points in play. And you're still going to have some guys towards the top. In fact, I would say that you're going to need 2 to 3 players towards the top end of the board, but you're going to have to be careful about those players with the ownership. And you certainly don't want to have all 5 or 6 players starting at the top. So to show you why you don't want 5 or maybe even 6 players starting in the top 10, this is why. And it's because of the ownership component. And these are from my Patreon page. So these are going to be maybe a little bit different than what we have on SHIPIT Nation later on. I end up posting these on my Patreon page for my members. These are just going to be, I believe, like the top 9 highest ownership players on the slate. And you can see it's almost entirely the top end of the leaderboard. So Pot Guider at just under 40%. A lot of times your 54-hole leader will be 40 to even 50% plus owned, but because it's a 7K player and I think enough people are going to fade him in their lineups, I'm only going to put him at just under 40%. I think that he's going to come in a little bit lower owned than most leaders will. A Max Grazerman, though, going to be about 30% owned at minus 17. Jake Knapp also getting a very hefty share of ownership at about 24%. And it's not entirely based on the leaderboard. Like guys like Chris Kirk, because he spun his wheels today a bit, aren't getting as much steam as some of these other players. But 20% ownership, especially like on a 7K guy, like a Putnam or a Michael Thor Bjornsson, you've got to be sold on a player at this sort of a number to want to use them in a lot of your lineups. And in fact, of these top 9 players, I believe I'm fading at least 5, if not 6 of those top 9 highest owned players. And the reason why I'm not taking as much of the chalk on a slate like this is because of the scoring average around here. And, you know, at a US Open, at a much more difficult golf course, we prioritize the placement points just a little bit more. But at a birdie fest like this, the meet still means something. You're still probably going to have the winner, probably another top 5, maybe even another top 10 that had another super low round that's getting a little bit of a boost to his placement points to take down the large field GPP. But that's at most maybe 3 placement point players that you're going to need when you're going to get 50 to 60, even 70 plus point rounds when you have a nuclear performance at the RBC let's call it RBC Heritage, but Detroit Golf Club, DGC as some would call it. You're going to have those players in your lineup as well. So I would say that the placement points are overrated on a week like this. And unless you're completely sold on somebody that's towards the top end of the ownership, of course, right, it may differ in a few cases, but you know, the same general idea is true. The top end of the leaderboard is going to be where a vast majority of that ownership is going to be. Then don't play them and take stands against those sort of players. So for this ownership and the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Same thing with the player poll. I post exactly who I'm using. And if you're over there, you'll be surprised to see just how many of those players that I'm actively avoiding. So it's, I think, something that people don't take into account that much is how easy or how hard the golf course is. You know, if this was the US Open, I'd probably want 3 or 4 placement guys in lineups. This time, 2 or 3 at most, maybe even just 1 or 2 in some of my GPP builds. The next thing up, after we have an idea of ownership and where the field is going to be playing, is trying to figure out who the hell we're going to be playing, who, you know, partially comes down to ownership. That's why we set the table with that. But the other component comes down to shots gained metrics. We can look at other outside metrics too, like round 4 historical. We can look at birdie or better percentage to try and find high upside guys, course history, a lot of different ways to round out the player pool like we've talked about for the last few days. We're going to do that here as well for round 4. And the placement point aspect does come into play as well. So what I typically do for my placement point players, and we're just going to start off there because we just looked at the top end of the ownership, is I take a look at the full event stats. And I normally want to look at the top ball strikers as my potential conviction plays and try and fade guys that have been putting well above their baseline. So for example, an Aldrich Potgeider gaining close to 10 strokes tee to green, 8 strokes ball striking through the first 3 rounds is one of the best numbers, if not the best number that we have in this field. I believe is number 2 in the category, just behind a Colin Morikawa, but a Jake Knapp grades out very well with this ball striking. A Thurston Lawrence as well, gaining over 8 strokes with the ball striking. A Davis Thompson, a Matt Fitzpatrick has gained almost 8 strokes in that category. Coincidentally, if you guys take a look at the player pool and the guys that I'm using as my conviction plays towards the top, it's a lot of the guys that we just pointed out. So it's not complete one-to-one. There's a few that I'm fading. There's a few guys on top of that I'm using for my placement points as well. But a vast majority of them, well over half of them, are a few of the players that I just pointed out there. So that's where I think the full event stuff can come in handy. But when you're trying to find the much more interesting plays, in my opinion, for Sunday Showdown, the leverage plays, the guys you're mixing to get different to the field, that's where I like to look at the round 3 stats. So that's where we start with shots gained, ball striking. That, of course, is where I'm looking for guys that were hitting the ball well today that hopefully can continue that kind of form or close to that form on Sunday. So players like a Chris Gotterup, Kurt Kitayama stand out, especially in that category. Jake Knapp, Fitzpatrick, just like they have for the entire event, were really hitting the ball well today. Same thing with Akshay Bhatia, Justin Lauer, Ryan Gerard, and Cameron Champ, all getting a boost in my process. And, some of them will be chalk, like your Jake Knapps, your Matt Fitzpatricks. But as I said, this is a great spot to find your leverage plays, which could be your Kurt Kitayamas, could be your Justin Lauers at T33. At Gotterup, I wouldn't call him a leverage play because at T20, he will get some steam at that portion of the board, but he's not going to be that mega chalk like you had in that top 5, top 10. So, there are some diamonds in the rough per se that you can find on this board, like a Cameron Champ. Not going to be over 10% owned, I wouldn't think, for Sunday Showdown. Potentially could be a look there. And then even Cam Young, he lost with the short game categories, but gained 2 strokes approach. Could be a little bit of a leverage play or a pivot that you take towards the top end of the pricing. And because a lot of the placement points are towards the middle of the board, maybe 8 and 9K range, Grazerman, I believe, is like the most expensive. I guess you could say Morikawa is technically a placement point guy too, but you don't have to start with Morikawa, right? You could jump down to a Grayson and then play a really balanced lineup. You could fit in a Cameron Young into that sort of lineup, still have placement points locked in that 8, 9, 10K range, and build out a lineup that has leverage up top and leverage in that 6 and 7K range. So the shots gained, ball striking is a good starting point for building your player pool. I also like to take a look at some of the short game stats. The opposite is kind of true with the short game, right? Guys that gained a bunch around the green with the putter can sometimes be looked at as a little bit as a red flag. So guys like Valimaki that gained 4 strokes putting, Chandler Phillips a little bit under 4 strokes in the category, but even your Grazerman, Malnati's, Ramey's, Davis Thompsons, etc., that gained almost or even a little bit over 3 strokes putting today are players that I give a slight downtick to, and it doesn't make them automatic fades. Like, for example, I believe of those guys we just pointed out, one of them is in my player pool for tomorrow, but a lot of them are going to be fades because of the fact that they were a little bit too short game dependent. So you can also look at the around the green. You don't have to hold it against them. It's not like it completely condemns any of these players, but it's a data point that works against some. So Aldrich Potgieter, your leader, he did have a good short game day, so it wasn't egregious in either category, but about 3 strokes in the short game categories is going to be pretty tough to reproduce, I would say. Also, Hideki Matsuyama, a Chris Kirk, a Chris Gotterup also. You can see over here, he gained 1 stroke around the green, was just kind of decent with the putting stats. It's nothing you want to hold too much against players. In fact, of some of these short game performances, I just realized with Hideki, I was looking at I believe these 2 categories, still about almost 2 strokes between the short game categories for Hideki Matsuyama. It's a slight red flag, but of those guys we just pointed out, I'm playing at least one of them still in my player pool. So the reason why I say that little bit of an asterisk towards the end is because this is only one part of the process. Ownership is a big part of it too. That's why somebody towards the top that has the red flag is maybe a little bit more of a fade than somebody towards the middle end of the board. Because if they're in the middle end of the board, no one's playing them anyways, then sometimes I'll overlook something like that to try and get somebody jammed in at 5 to 7% ownership that has upside to shoot low around this golf course. And, maybe it isn't that specific category that's doing it, but maybe they're a high birdie percentage guy. And, I kind of turn the blind eye to the shots gained metrics and hope that we get a spike performance from them. And sure, it's a highly volatile play, but in GPPs, there's a time and place to getting to that sort of an option. And then what I also look for could be some short game regression candidates. So if we take a look at the round 3 stats and guys that lost a whole bunch of strokes putting or around the green, it's not necessarily a good thing that they lost all those strokes, but oftentimes you'll see them regress rather quickly to the mean. And, we pointed out a few examples of that over the first few rounds, right? Morikawa was a great example. Davis Thompson has also been an extremely volatile putter this week. So Luke Clanton, don't be surprised if he gains 3-4 strokes putting tomorrow just because he couldn't find the bottom of the hole at all today. Siwoo Kim, same thing. Camilo Villegas, David Skins, all these guys that were heavily into the dark red in this category. You don't want to completely absolve them of their sins, particularly if they lost strokes in the shots gained ball striking categories. However, if they were somewhat decent, like a Camilo was, a Luke Clanton, he didn't have the best iron day, but he did gain off the tee at least. Like, there are certain players towards the top that I'll be using as short game regression candidates. And it's with the around the green too. And if you can combine a crappy around the green play and a putting day, then that can be an even bigger bounce back spot. So like, for example, Benny Ann, he had actually a slightly positive ball striking day, but lost about 5 strokes in the short game categories. Like, that's highly unlikely to happen in back-to-back rounds. That's another way that you can leverage these stats to your advantage. So on top of this, I look for high upside golfers. Those would be players that make a whole bunch of birdies. We've talked about that a few times this week already as well. But to find that, you just go on the PGA Tour website, click stats, and go to birdie or better percentage. Those sort of guys correlate directly to their DraftKings score. And then also players that have good course history around here. And the course history players are very rare after the cut line. In fact, a lot of the course history guys at the Rocket Mortgage did not make the cut this week. Like, for example, a Norn, a Homa, a lot of the guys that consistently have like top 10, top 15 at this golf course, almost all of them, like Cam Davis, multiple time winner, all ended up either missing the cut or withdrawing before the event started. So there was a couple, though, that ended up squeaking their way through. I used a few of them in my player pool for tomorrow. But those sort of things, round 4 historical, that's a great thing that we have in the SHIPIT Nation Stone. We have also got things like Ben Poa putting. You can take a look at that. Whatever your process has to try and find a player pool, just commit to it, right? Make sure that you have that process, that you're consistently improving it and refining it over time, and that you have multiple reasons for getting to players. And the only thing that I think you should really avoid, I mean, there's a lot of creative freedom when it comes to your PGA DFS process, trying to beat the rest of the field, because, you know, you don't want to be doing the exact same thing as somebody else. You're still trying to beat them at the end of the day. So, you know, maybe take bits and pieces from people that you respect in the industry. You know, from the show, for example, right? Take bits and pieces that you like and incorporate them yourself, but also have that freedom and, you know, have the kind of confidence to also make it your own as well. So any of those sort of things that we mentioned, adding on top of it, don't be shy whatsoever. But let me see if there's any player pool deep dives that we need to go through. Afterwards, we're going to talk some strategy in the contest on DraftKings and wrap this thing all together. So what's going on, Chris? You said you've been slightly off each round. Great weekend so far. Yeah, so it looks like you're probably profiting, right? But just not getting that GPP takedown. That means you're on the right track, though. So keep at it, man. Hopefully, we'll see you at the top tomorrow. You're sitting in 256 in the big lottery, so you're telling you there's a chance. For sure, Wayne, that's a good spot to be in. Like in a 40,000 entry contest, that's a good spot heading into Sunday. Kitayama looks to match up really well. Yep. I think that he makes some sense, too. Shots gained metrics are at least somewhat favorable. He's still Kurt Kitayama, though, and Kurt Kitayama, who hasn't had some form, but there's an inkling of success there. In fact, I'm playing him just in case he ends up popping off. Shout out for all the content. Who are the highest owned guys at -15? So I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head, like at exactly that number, who the highest owned guys are, but they're going to be relatively high owned. So I showed you guys like some of the exact ownership numbers at the top, but like of these -15s, they're like Colin Morikawa's probably the highest owned of those guys just because he's at the top end of the board. But Højgaard is higher owned than some of the other 7K guys. Harry Hall is a little bit chalkier than some of the other 9, 10K players are. They're chalkier than most players in general, I would say. Going to be an epic showdown slate. Yeah, a lot of regular points on the table. So don't sleep on getting nasty with some mid to early starters. DraftKings got to get better with the pricing, though. Good Lord. Yeah, there's not much they can do with 86 players, unfortunately. It's a tough situation to be in with so many extra players on the weekend. What happened to our boy Clanton? Not sure. He had a really bad putting day, it looks like. I mean, losing 5 strokes putting, something was going on. So I'd have to ask him. I don't really want to do it during the event, but maybe after the fact I can ask, because it wasn't even just today. He lost strokes putting rounds 1 and 2 as well today was just the most glaring example of that. So maybe I can ask him exactly what happened. Gerard's been nice and consistent all week. Amen to that. I can co-sign that. Do I like him to finally have a nuts round? I'm using him, and I've used him in every single slate so far, and he's paid off every single time. Like, he's never been the nuts. So can he pull that off tomorrow? It comes down to the putter, because the ball striking's been there all 3 days. He had a lot more putting luck today, where he was just trickling in putts, which is kind of sketchy. I mean, it wasn't like he was confidently rolling them in or anything. Like, he was kind of using the Bubba Watson method and just hoping them into the front edge. But if he does that again tomorrow, I mean, yeah, he could have another really good like -5, -6 round. So I'm going to be using him for sure. Can we get a deep dive on Kurt Kitayama? For sure. So I went through the shots gained metrics a little bit before, but ball striking today was excellent. Over 4 shots gained in the ball striking categories. In short game, he lost about 2 strokes. So if you're a believer in ball striking, being relatively consistent from day to day, and then short game being more volatile, and Kurt Kitayama has to be on your list. So like I said before, he will be in my pool. Favorite pivots off of Pot Guider. So I'm not really the kind of person that's just going to give you guys pivots, BHaze. So I don't like those questions, and I kind of refuse them. So if you have a few players that you were considering at that number and you want me to maybe give the pros and cons between them, I can do that. But for my player pool and for who I'm using on any given slate for that kind of thing, I'm going to have you check out the Patreon page. That's what that is for. What's going on? Go Collect. Welcome on in. Last one. And hey, you don't have to feel bad about them. You can hit me with as many deep dives as you want, man. And can I look at Bhatia? We absolutely can. So Akshay also really good ball striking, but lost with the short game categories. So I think you know what you're looking for, right? I mean, at least with these 2 stat profiles, they're almost the exact same. And I'm on both of them for my lineups on round 4. So they're low owned in both cases, especially with Akshay at T55. He's got an earlier tee time, which really doesn't matter whether it's going to be consistent, but the earlier tee time does mean that his ownership is going to be peanuts compared to some of the chalk around him. So, if you're playing a Pot Guider chalk down low, let's say at like 40%, then you're might want to get different towards the top, right? That might be one of the spots that you might want to compensate for that kind of ownership. So he could make a lot of sense in those builds. Is Grayson a little smoke and mirrors? You don't think that his ball striking has been as strong? You'd be correct if that was your assumption. So if we go towards the top, you see that he's gaining 8 strokes with the putter. Those are the kind of guys that, raise a relatively big red flag. So if the ball striking is something that you're really weighing, he's got the worst outside of Andrew Putnam towards the top. And the biggest red flag of all would have to be Putnam, who is losing about 4 strokes ball striking and has gained 13, almost 14 strokes in the short game categories. That is hard to believe that he can continuously do that going forward. He said, started to say that birdie or better percentage is the most important stat, is what I said before. I'm not sure what PP is. Decky is a conundrum wrapped in a riddle. I like the way you worded that, man. And welcome on in, my dude. You're always in these live streams, one of the sweaty tryhards. And shots gained metrics, losing off the tee, but gaining a bunch with the approach play. I mean, to me, it's a conundrum that he can't figure it out. I mean, he knows what the problem is. He's only losing in one of the 4 stat categories. But if he has a good off the tee day, then watch out. And Hideki's kind of known for having Sunday emergences. In fact, it's scary enough that I may consider adding him to the player pool. As of right now, I'm not using him, but he is known as a pretty good Sunday player. What's going on, Mark? Welcome on in. You have an 8K outright on Grayson. How does he look? Wow, that's going to be a heck of a sweat for you, man. Best of luck. You're in a decent spot, of course. And he's gaining a bunch with the putter. Then, as we mentioned, the ball striking needs to be better. He's got to improve on that. I have a hard time thinking he's going to close out this golf tournament losing strokes on approach. If he can gain 1.5, 2 strokes in that category, then he's doing everything else well to go out there and close it out. So just hope he's working on the irons. Probably got out to the range this afternoon to try and iron it out. And in round 3 in particular, he did also lose today. Let's look at round 2. Yeah, round 2 he lost as well. It's moving in a negative direction. So definitely needs to find the plug to that hole. You ran into Keith Mitchell, but didn't end up doing anything. Remembered your comment from yesterday, man. Yeah, dude, he's tall and he's a little bit of a unit. I don't know if I would say anything like I was saying. He said, could Thor win this thing? Yeah, he could. I mean, he's been in position a few times on tour, has yet to close the door at this point. I would say, though, that he also, just like we had with Grazerman, a little bit short game dependent. So I'm never going to say never on a player, but when you've gained 8 of your strokes in those 2 categories, but you're losing on approach and just slightly into the positive off the tee, which for him, by the way, is well below his baseline. He's normally a much better off the tee player than that. Then it's a little bit concerning to me. So I wouldn't say that he's one of my favorites to win this thing, but he certainly could get that thing done. So you're saying placement points is what you meant earlier. Okay, yeah, you got to emphasize what you mean by that. That was not so intuitive, but you said, did I say that placement points might be a little bit more important this week? No, they're a little bit less important this week just because of the scoring aspect. When your average fantasy score is higher, the ratio of points that comes from your placement points is lower and lower. And like, for example, at a US Open, when it's very difficult conditions, when you're only scoring on average like 25 to 30 fantasy points, sometimes even lower than that at a very difficult major championship, then they matter a whole lot more because the 12 points, maybe it's 13 points they're getting for first place, it matters a lot more than it otherwise would. So no, it's the exact opposite actually. You have a ticket on them too. Oh my, you picked the 2 guys that have really, really good short games this week. That's hard to pull off, by the way. That's the most unpredictable part of golf. All that you have to have happen is they've got to find their swing tomorrow, which can happen. I mean, you see that happen with plenty of players before. Just hope they wake up early, maybe get out there. They've got late tee times, so they can work on it tomorrow if they need to. They don't even have to wake up that early. Just figure out the damn thing before the round starts, right? Of course. And Killer Keith has the personality of an untipped waiter. Hooves, you're an absolute legend with those one-liners. Let's go through the contest selection, which is a little bit bigger than the day before. For example, the Sand Trap is $25K bigger in terms of the prize pool, which doesn't really change the payout structure. In fact, it's a third to first place now. So the big $25 is going to be a massive no from me. The other contests, though, like this big, whatever they call it, the par 4, where it's a $250 four max. So it's $1,000 to max enter this thing. It's a little bit bigger. So these kind of contests have a slightly better payout structure, but overall, it's a lot of the same stuff that we said yesterday. I mean, the best contests are going to be your single entries. This one is a 5th place to 5th the first, which is not the best, I would say. So the big $100 single entry is maybe not that great, but you do have your $12 and your $33 single entries, which are usually going to be on the board here. So here's the Albatross. This one is 10% to first place. If we find the dog leg, that's the $33 single entry that I was just referring to. This one is also 10% to first place. So I would say for a lot of people watching this, particularly if you're not playing like thousands of dollars on every single showdown slate, should be max entering these contests in terms of single entries. And then maybe some free maxes, maybe some 20 max contests for some of the smaller stake stuff too, to diversify your portfolio. And the reason for that is that like the big GPPs, like that Sand Trap, the big $25, sure, they have that nice shiny prize of $50K to first place. But once you get past that $50K, it drops off like a rock. So, you know, it's tough to beat 7,000 people. So that's why I say to stay away from those contests unless you're max entering them and to focus on ones that are a little bit more sustainable. And even the $5 GPP is also top heavy. It's a 5th to first place as well. So I'm personally going to scale back my GPP exposure and I'm going to ramp up my single entry exposure for tomorrow. So just trying to make sure that I'm entering contests that make sense. And like I said, I won't completely abandon GPP exposure because I just love max entering. I love MMEing, even if it's not a whole 150 max on this kind of a slate. But I won't overextend myself if the contests aren't right for the taking. And then with the lineup construction, so actually putting together a lineup for you guys, I like to start at the top end of the board. So I like to knock out my placement points right off the bat. And just because a lineup's harder to differentiate when you start with a pot guider, we're going to do that to kind of corner ourselves and make our life a little bit harder. And of course, the purpose of that is to kind of show you what you should be navigating when you are playing some chalk. So let's throw in a pot guider. Let's also throw in a Morikawa at $10,700. And then I'm not going to throw in a third placement points guy yet. As of right now, I'm only going to throw in the 2. Maybe we get another guy that's starting in like the top 20 into this lineup. But the rest of it, this is where I want to look for some of those middle tee time players, the guys that aren't going to be as popular that we can use for a little bit of leverage. And there are a lot of those kind of guys that make sense. So just for example, let me actually go to my player pool. I know we talked about a few before, but I'll give you guys a few examples of guys that I'm using in the AK range. In my opinion, the AK range is just the absolute mother load when it comes to plays. So, for example, Ryan Gerard, we've mentioned him a couple times to this point. He's starting at T20, so he's on the fringe of placement point potential, but he's going to be a little bit lower owned. So let's throw him into there at that $8,500 mark. And also in that AK range, we're going to throw in an Akshay Bhatia at $8,700 because just like Gerard, actually even more so because he's T55, he's going to be a lot lower owned than those other chalky players. And just because placement points are part of the picture for tomorrow doesn't mean it's the end all be all. And you've got to remember golf's a variant sport. There's going to be pressure in play for some of those leaders as well. There's also a lot of slapdicks that are in contention towards the top end of the board. A lot of them are going to fall like bricks. So you don't want to have those guys in your lineups. And sometimes these chasers are the ones that have that -6, -7 round. And something else going for Bhatia as well that I think makes him a really good play is that he had a really slow start. He had like no birdies through his first 13 holes or 12 holes. And then he made 4 or 5 in a row. So I love that kind of momentum heading into tomorrow. Hopefully he can keep that going. We'll throw in another leverage play here too. So like you might be tempted to want to throw in a Mark Hubbard or a Putnam who's starting at the top, even a Thor Bjornsson. I want to be a little bit more cognizant about the ownership and maybe throw in a Michael Kim. So we have $6,700 to round out this kind of lineup, as long as you're not taking a super chalky guy as your last man in. So like I would probably avoid your Subers, your Ramies as your last man in, but really anyone that's below 10% ownership as a last man into this kind of lineup, I would feel pretty good about because, we made a few ownership pivots, particularly with like a Bhatia, a Michael Kim, a Ryan Gerard, right? They're also not going to be super chalky, but especially in the case of Gerard Kim, they're in the top half of the field. They made the cuts. So they're playing really solid golf through their first 54 holes. And you still are going to have to shoot like -5, maybe even -6 or better tomorrow to make it to the optimal lineup. So give me guys like Gerard that have been ball striking the living hell out of it, right? Bhatia today gained ball striking, lost short game, same thing. Michael Kim has also had a pretty decent stat profile. No matter who your last man is, as long as you're avoiding 2 of those really chalky players in Super Ramey, you're going to have the leverage that you need, and you're going to have enough placement points because, sure, Pot Guide or Morikawa are mostly where you're getting those from. But if Gerard has a really good round, like he could get into the top 10, maybe even like the top 7, which would be pretty much placement point potential right there with like top 7 and that -6 round. And Kim, Bhatia, maybe your last man in, you're not getting that sort of thing, but that's okay. If you're getting -5, -6 rounds out of these kind of players, you could take down the biggest of GPPs, $25, $5 GPP. And that's really what I'm worried about with my lineup construction. So placement points, parts of the process for tomorrow, but a little bit less so part of the process for tomorrow's showdown slate. So that's all I've got, guys. Best of luck with all of your exposure for Sunday. I hope to see a lot of your names towards the top end of the leaderboards. Make sure to check out the SHIPIT Nation website tonight, the Stone in particular for the round 4 projections and some of the tools for the Sunday slate. We have that round 4 historical on there. Also, we've got the approach series and the putting series, which are great for going through the shots gain metrics. And of course, guys, you guys can find my projections, my player poll, some of the projections I was showing you guys before completely uncensored on my Patreon page, which can be found on my X/Twitter, and in the bio, there's a link to it on there. But other than that, guys, that is all I've got for tomorrow's slate. Smash the like button if you guys haven't already, and also subscribe to the channel so you guys don't miss any of the content to come. But best of luck with everything that you guys are going with, and I'll see you guys for all the content next week.